Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the move of What If Deku fell and Bakugou broke? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. You know, if you really want to be a hero that badly, there's actually another way. Just pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. Could I ever hope to be someone like you? I honestly don't think you can be a hero without a quirk. Each step home felt heavy, as if cinder blocks were strapped to the back of Izuku's shoes. Eyes welled up with fat tears that fell in uneven lines down his freckled face. It was painful, the words and voices that seemed to be stuck on repeat in his head. Even his absolute mentor, his hero, his obsession didn't believe in him. He thought All Might believed in everything, right? He believed he could save people, could fight anyone and win? Was he just that useless, that even All Might, the greatest hero with the biggest smile, didn't believe in him? Couldn't just smile at him and say, "Yes, you can do anything you set your mind to." With a thumbs up and a shining smile. Like Izuku imagined he would? Imagination didn't seem to get him anywhere, did it? He imagined he would be able to save others, to help those in need, to be a great hero. And yet, what every last person told him was that dream would never come true. How would he ever survive if All Might was almost taken down? The thought made a small choked sound pass through his lips. He remembered the feeling of choking on the thick slime, completely immobile, taken down within just a moment. The feeling of his airways completely filling up and eyes rolling to the back of his head as he passed out. He didn't even stand a chance. Shutting his eyes tightly for a moment, he brought his arm up to wipe at his messy face with his sleeve. Dropping his arm, he glanced around, realizing he could see his apartment building just ahead. Quickly, he brought his hands up to his face and tried his best to clean up, shoving down any thoughts and feelings for the moment. He couldn't let his mom see him like this, it would just cause her more trouble. Izuku tried to steady himself, breathing in deeply and taking slow steps up the stairs to calm himself. He glanced down at the thing he'd been holding in his hand this whole time, still soggy and covered in burn marks. Hero analysis for the future, just thinking he actually got it signed by All Might himself sent a tiny thrill through him. Izuku almost started beaming before he realized what was said afterward. Frowning deeply, his eyebrows screwed down, he let out a deep sigh. Just looking at it made his heart ache. He clutched it tightly in his hand for a moment, and hesitating, he threw it off the balcony. Without another look, he turned his head to the door ahead of him, his jaw set in a look of restraining sadness. I'm home. Sorry I'm late, I had to finish up some schoolwork. He lied with a little shakiness to it, shutting the door behind him and locking it with a small click. The familiar surroundings of their little apartment made him calm somewhat. "Oh, Izuku honey, are you hungry? I was just about to make dinner." Her soft voice made him smile just a tad. It was always warm and caring. He wrapped an arm around himself, he wanted to cry again, he could feel it, pooling around his eyes and pain pushing up into his neck and chest. Just hearing her voice made him want to sob out everything to her. Of course, he could never, his mom was already stressed every day because of him. He let out a deep breath and tried to keep it together for her. "No tea thanks, I'm really tired. I'm gonna go to bed." He pushed the words out just barely before he rushed off. His face turned the other way as to protect the sight of the tears already filling up his eyes. He shut it with another deep breath, running his hands up over his face and setting them in his own messy curls. Clutching at the green mop, he sunk to the floor, body shaking and sobs just barely coming out quiet. Pressing his forehead to his knees, it was too much. The shock of it all crumbling. Sure, Kaken always hurt his feelings, but it never really got to him. Never really ruined his plans for the future or made him not believe anymore. But All Might, the greatest hero, saying he couldn't be a hero like him shattered the dream like glass. He always believed he could do it. Never let it get to him, but now it was hitting him like a truck. He knew now that he would never be able to fulfill what he had always wanted to do. He looked up just a bit over his shaky knees, his bleary eyes blinking as he took in the scene of his absolutely pathetic room. All Might collectibles covered the whole thing, posters from wall to wall, shelves held so many sizes of figurines and plush toys, anything themed around his all-time favorite hero could be found here. Of course, other hero stuff was here and there, but overall it was blatantly clear All Might was his favorite. He'd looked up to everything All Might did pretty much since he was born. He wants to be just like him. He will always want to be like him. Izuku thought he was optimistic. That's just how his brain worked. Kaken would push him down and his brain would just ignore it, focusing on the goal he aspired to reach. Now it was like being hit with a bat, the feeling of being told he would never be good enough, never be able to get over that he was born quirkless. He would never survive. Why couldn't he just be as strong as All Might? As Kaken? That's all he's ever wanted, was to have a chance. His shaky hands reached to clutch at the front of his school uniform. His tears were falling steadily now, dripping down his cheeks. Kaken, just the thought of his name made Izuku let out a hard sob. That he hissed under his breath. He clutched the front of his uniform even harder, his fingers turning white under the pressure. All he ever did was want to be his friend. He knew Kaken was amazing. He told the rough blonde that all the time. Izuku had always looked up to him. He wanted to be like him. He had always wanted Kaken to like him. Kaken never did. He looked at Izuku like he was a bug under the bottom of his shoe and he happily squished him. Izuku followed him everywhere anyways, his mind coming up with excuses as to why Kaken acted the way he did sometimes. It was still painful, but Izuku cared so much. He didn't know how to explain his obsession with Kaken. He was the only friend he's ever had and well his best friend. At least that's how he thought of it. Izuku let out a heavy sigh. He pressed his knees together again and breathed in and out shakily. He was hyperventilating again. He finally let go of his grip on the school uniform jacket he was wearing, his chest rising and falling in uneven patterns. He shut his eyes tightly for the moment, concentrating on his breathing. Izuku wished he could hate someone, but he couldn't. He worshipped All Might and he adored his childhood friend. He didn't have anyone to hate but himself. After his breathing calmed down, he stood up with a sigh, his fingers fumbling with the buttons on the top of the uniform coat. Izuku shucked it off the back of his shoulders, throwing it in a hamper along with the undershirt as he got that off him as well. Hissing, he bit the bottom of his lip with a pained look, his fingers slowly sliding over his flat chest and stomach, cringing when he felt over a soft spot. A few bruises were blotched over the area like large indigo polka dots. A couple dotted his shoulders. He didn't really know if he deserved them. He had gotten them from school, of course. Kaken's extras, doing work while the firecracker seemed to keep watch or say mean things. He didn't even fight back, the threat of Kaken's quirk overbearing. He'd never make it as a hero if he couldn't even protect himself from a measly punch. Tears pricked at his eyes again. All Might was right. Trying to not think any more, he slid his breaths down, throwing them in the hamper before he made his way to his bedside drawer. Under a bunch of random papers and a couple books, he found a medium-sized plastic circular container. Pulling the top off, he dipped 2 of his fingers into the tan cream and started applying it on the swollen parts of his skin. It was a task he's done a few times before and he'd just shut off his brain as he continued. Finishing, the achy stinging seemed to dim a little bit. He threw on the first shirt he grabbed from his drawer. Of course it was something All Might themed. Usually he would be happy to wear it, but it just felt as if he didn't even deserve to. He fell in bed and tried his best to turn his brain off. It was easy to fall asleep early when he was so mentally exhausted. He just didn't want to think anymore. In the morning he awoke to the harsh sound of his red and blue alarm clock. It had yellow bunny ears on top. Usually seeing it in the morning would make him grin a little. After all Might was one of the most important things that fueled his dream. But this morning, Izuku's eyes looked lazily over the clock. Eyes crusty and dried tears blotching up his face. Just seeing it made his chest fill up with a sharp pain and he reached out his arm to press down on the bunny ears softly to stop the beeping. A strong sigh leaving his lips, he suddenly smacked his hands over his face with a groan of the overwhelming feeling of never wanting to get back up again. Yeah, he was tired in the mornings, but it didn't compare to the absolute despair radiating out of his heart and making its way through his body. It felt like a car was laying on top of him. Nevertheless, he forced himself out of bed, throwing on a clean uniform and fumbling with the buttons once again. He made his way over to his small wooden desk, expecting to see his school books and scattered papers of homework he had finished the night before. He looked dumbly at his desk for a moment, realizing he didn't even open up his backpack last night. He couldn't help but let a high-pitched sound rush past his lips as he frantically opened his bag beside the bed, anxiety pressing its way through his chest and leaving him dizzy. Homework. God, his homework. He couldn't make it to UA if he didn't keep up his grades. Izuku found himself opening up the folder where he kept the work that needed to be done, only to find a couple pages that weren't even due till the next day. He let out a breath of relief. Still, he should have started on them if he wanted. A dread suddenly overcame him, shoulders slouching and a deep frown appearing on his face. He slid the folder back in his bag, gently zipping it up. He didn't even have the motivation anymore to finish homework. What was the point if he would never be able to do what he dreamed of? He stood, glancing around the room for a second. Feeling just so off, usually he'd be looking at his phone for the latest hero news he might have missed when he was asleep. Right now, he was still itching to do it, but even thinking of it made him want to cry. So, he just grabbed up his bag and headed out of the room. He closed the door gently behind him, setting the bag in the hallway and entering the bathroom to make himself at least look school presentable. As soon as he was finished, he got out, closing the door behind him and sighing softly, eyes a bit downcast as he ran a hand through his always messy curls. Just about to get his bag, his mom stood just between where the hallway started and the living room and kitchen ended. "Izuku, are you okay?" Her hand was clutched over the top of her blouse, eyes big and face set in a concerned look. Izuku could already see it, the worried and pained look in her eyes. Always his fault, he always worried her. He warbled, nervously letting out a small chuckle and trying to put a smile on for her, grabbing up his bag in his arms and walking into the kitchen beside her. "Yamamo, of course. I was just tired last night, that's all," he replied with a small hum. He tugged at the strings on his bag, glancing the other way as he listened to her. "You didn't eat last night and looked upset when you came home." She clutched her hands a little harder over the top of her shirt, looking up at him with a small sigh. Her eyes glanced away for a second. It seemed to be a battle in her thoughts. "Did something happen at school again? I thought you told me all that stopped." Her voice was so close to the edge of crying that Izuku could feel his heart being slowly crushed again. Why couldn't he just keep everything inside and stop worrying her? "No, Mom, of course not. There was just a lot of work yesterday and I was tired." He smacked a grin on his face, voice wavering just a bit. He could hear his own voice echoing in his head from how loud he'd been. Breakfast then?" He chuckled stupidly, voice lowered, and his eyes moved to the kitchen. He wasn't even hungry, but anything to get out of this conversation. His mom didn't need to worry about anything. She'd already done that all her life. So he sat down with her, ignoring her eyes of barely contained concern. He tried to smile and to talk, but it was so hard with all the emotions bubbling up from seeing her caring face. Playing with his food and watching the clock dumbly, when he found it was a decent time, he placed his fork down. "Thanks, Mom." Izuku sent one last shaky smile to her before quickly standing up and grabbing his bag. Before she got the chance to say anything else, he was out the door. Inko stared down at her son's uneaten plate of food and she couldn't help but feel something horrible set in the pit of her stomach. Izuku's smile fell as he shut the door behind him. He let out a deep sigh before beginning to walk down the stairs and to school. Fingers wrapped around the straps of his backpack and eyes downcast, just letting his body do the work of getting him there. It was weird. He didn't know what to think about anymore. What if not about becoming a hero or obsessing over them? Any other job just made him cringe and sigh. It would never be what he wanted to do. But All Might said his dreams needed to be obtainable. He choked out a breath at being reminded of the conversation. Shaking his head quickly, he tried his best to stop thinking about it. It was so hard when all he could think of was how he would never compare to anyone. Even with other jobs, they were made easier with quirks. All Might didn't believe in him, the greatest hero of all time. So how could he ever make it? He'd already run through these thoughts again and again. It was just being repeated. What would he do now? Live a mediocre life of doing something he didn't enjoy and wasn't ever gonna be as good as other people at? Finally, his thoughts were stopped when he came up to the small campus. At least he was good at schoolwork. He was best in class, just a point or two in front of Kakin. It didn't help the constant burning in his chest and heavy feeling over his shoulders, but it was something. He changed shoes at the front, putting his favorite red sneakers in the locker before he headed straight to class. No one really noticed him, of course. He didn't really have any friends. Well, there was Kakin, but that was not difficult. He saw people in the hallways, talking, laughing, always grouped up in some number. Sure, it hurt a bit, people didn't seem to like him, they found him weird. But it'd be okay, it didn't matter. Fiddling with his bag, he saw his homeroom classroom ahead. Izuku quickly made his way towards it, just wanting to get the day over with already. Heading inside, he immediately felt off. He'd heard sounds when he was walking up, but when he entered the room, people started shushing others, some sitting silent and looking away, something clearly hidden on their faces. He could hear giggles and feel eyes on him as he stopped in the entrance, confused on what he couldn't see. The air in the room was making him anxious. He clutched the sides of his bag a little harder. Something rising up in his neck. He glanced over to Kakin. He was just sitting there, feet up on the desk and not even looking his way. Izuku could see Kakin's friends, though. They were standing beside another's desk and looking like they were about to bow over in laughter. He wasn't stupid. He could tell something was up. And it just made him want to leave. The teacher wasn't here yet, maybe he could back out. It was clearly something about him. Deciding to get it over with, probably like a tack on his seat or something stupid like that. They just wanted to see him embarrass himself. So, sking in a deep breath, he shook his head before making it to his desk. He really didn't want to deal with this right now. He really didn't think he could take much more. Izuku was stopped in his tracks by the sight of his desk. Eyes widening a bit, a feeling deep in his chest shook him, like stabbing pain. He couldn't take this, not right now. Stark black marker covered the space, words written by uncaring hands in bold letters. Words, lots of hurtful words, that struck him hard each time his eyes read over them. There was different handwriting and sizes. It was clearly not just done by a couple people. The thought hit him hard. Did everyone hate him? Words had been thrown at him or hateful comments before, but this was different. This was actually the point where he could feel his heart breaking. Embarrassment burned bright over his face. He could hear people snickering, waiting to see him react. They wanted him to die. They wanted him gone. He could feel tears bubbling up in his eyes and his face scrunched up pathetically. The grip on his bag loosened and it fell next to his chair with a hard sound. Quirkless was the biggest word, right in the middle of his desk, written in bold. But that's not what bothered him. He hears that every day. The other words, the comments, that's what hit him hard. Worthless, weak, pathetic, delusional, freak. The words seemed to go on and on. When his eyes crossed over them, he couldn't help the whimper that passed through his pressed lips. There were comments there too. Stuff that Kakin had said before and new things that seemed to take a bite out of his heart. They seemed to like what Kakin had said the other day. Maybe you can fly, test it out. They wouldn't even let you into the general course, freak. See if you can breathe underwater, you might want to stay under for a while. People have quirks activated by blood, why don't you start with your wrist? His chest and throat burned as he blinked back tears that always seemed to want to escape. They just wanted to see him cry. He ignored the eyes and shakily sat down in his chair. Slowly leaning down to unzip his bag and pull out a binder, putting it on top of his desk and opening it so it would cover most of the words written. He felt it, crashing waves of despair. He had to bite harshly on his lower lip to stop the tears again. Maybe he would have been able to handle it a week ago, but now, he knew these words were true. The comments, it was just too much. He sunk a little bit, hand holding his head up, eyes looking so downward that they were blurring. How could they say those kinds of things? He didn't have the confidence now to try and stand up for himself. Just to slide through it, that it'll be over soon. He could still feel eyes on him, but it was over quickly when the teacher walked in and demanded attention. The teacher started to drone on, end-of-the-year work, and high school criteria. Usually Izuku would be glued to anything having to do with finally moving up to high school, but he was completely out of it, staring at the pages and going through them like a robot. He was stuck in his own mind, just wondering why anything was worth it anymore. After all, no one wanted him here, he was a burden to his mother, and his goals and aspirations were flushed down the toilet. All because he didn't have a quirk, he was ostracized from his classmates, a failure in his dreams, and he had no place in society. His only friend that he looked up to since forever and basically worshipped treated him like dirt. There was no point to anything anymore. It just felt like he didn't need to be here anymore. He didn't want to deal with the facts anymore. Izuku was absently swirling his pencil over the paper, detailing more high schools, interests, and classes. He couldn't even bring himself to try and choose something other than U.A or keep U.A on the sign-up paper they got a week ago. Of course, he could sign up for the general course, but the thought of being around people every day that were following his dreams that he could never follow himself made his chest throb. Head still resting in his hand, he flipped his pencil around to erase the top of the sign-up page. His face was contorted into some kind of dismal look. Fingers shaking and top teeth biting down into the flesh of his bottom lip to hold back the swarming tears. He knew he had to put something down. But he couldn't come up with anything. He didn't want to go anywhere. No place would ever make him happy. He pulled the binder up a little with the underside of his finger. He cared so much. Seeing what his own classmates wrote about him made his stomach twist again. He remembered the way All Might looked at him. Like he was getting in the way, like he was annoying. Just like how Kaken looked at him, just like his classmates. His mom she looked at him like he was a burden, she always looked so worried. His stomach was twisted and his head felt light, but he didn't cry now. He didn't want to be looked at like that anymore. The class was over after a while. He passed up his empty sheet with the rest. Izuku watched everyone get up and leave as fast as they could. Even the teacher was already leaving the room before Izuku could throw his backpack on. He didn't look at his desk again as he followed suit behind the rest. If he didn't go to lunch, he'd just get in trouble. It almost made him happy that no one decided to say something to him after class. He just couldn't take the confrontation anymore. So, just like every day, he sat by himself around the front. Tray in front of him full of rice, but he was barely eating. His stomach was still twisted. He didn't know why, but his eyes glanced over to the table where Kaken was. Sitting with his friends, a meal from home in front of him. Kaken was eating, barely paying attention to the people around him. Izuku found himself thinking again about why he was so horrible to Kaken. What had he done wrong? Moving his eyes back down, he shoved more rice into his mouth, swallowing harshly. Already getting nauseous from his thoughts, he just got up to throw the tray away. He barely got to sit back down at his lone table before he felt a taller figure standing over him. His eyes quickly moved up to see a spiky blonde. A scowl already plastered over his face. Izuku couldn't even react like normal anymore. Usually he would look nervous and try his best to not get beat up by Kaken's friends or get his things ruined. He turned his head over to the blonde, his eyes already swimming with tears and hands shaking in his lap. He just didn't want to do this anymore. Why couldn't Kaken just be nice? Why couldn't he just understand? Kaken's eyes seemed to flash some actual emotion for a moment before he was smacking his hand on the table and making Izuku almost jump out of his skin. Finally decided to listen to me, huh? His lips pet up into an unappealing smirk. Izuku didn't even want to cry anymore. He just looked up at Kaken for a moment and with a shaky voice he just said it. Yeah. Eyes blurring with tears, he looked away, staring at the table as if it was the most interesting thing in the world. He didn't realize it, but his body was shaking like a leaf. You really want me to die, Kaken? Izuku didn't notice, but Kaken's face almost looked shocked. It even took him a moment to come up with something back. Good, I don't want to see your but trying to get in Yuta, he spat, walking away a little faster than normal. The comment wasn't even one of his good ones. Izuku didn't even listen to what Kaken had said, he was just blank at the moment. Even when the bell rang, he was out of it. He just slowly got up and headed to class. Sitting back down on his marked-up desk and staring at the binder he guessed he had opened. He didn't know why, the back of his mind felt blank, he just wasn't feeling it at the moment. For some reason the only feeling he had was his throat burning like he was going to cry, but nothing came out. Class seemed to pass by like a dream. He was staring straight through the wall and into nothingness. The only thing that woke him from his blinding depression was the ringing of the last school bell. Before he could even stand up, everyone was already rushing out the door, talking, and within the commotion Izuku's backpack had been knocked over and his stuff strewn about. Then he was alone. He sighed softly, rubbing at the side of his face as he picked up the papers and books from the ground and stuffing them in his bag. Zipping it up carefully, he slowly stood, wrapping it around his back as he headed up to the front. Something sick crawled into his mind. The teacher had left for a meeting already, and there lay a ring of keys on the top of the desk. Izuku slowly reached his hand out, picking up the keys and clutching them tight in his hand. Sking in a breath, he gathered enough courage to stuff them in his front pocket and leave the room. He had never stolen anything in his life. It was a weird, guilty feeling that tickled his stomach. He didn't plan on keeping them, he just needed them for a few hours. Wiping away a spare tear that seemed to escape, he changed out his shoes and headed outside to the front. Voices seemed to swirl all around him and make him nauseous. It was like he couldn't hear what they were saying over the desolate feeling in his mind. He found himself sitting on a bench near the school, bag beside him. He couldn't bring himself to go home, to go back to his mom like this. He just couldn't. He didn't want to see her face when he headed home, looking like a zombie. He couldn't bear to see her cry again. He could remember her when he was much younger, sitting on the couch with a whole gallon of ice cream in her lap and crying her eyes out. His dad had left only months ago, and he couldn't help but wonder if she would have gone with him if he wasn't here. Every time she would look at him, he could just see all the worry and stress in her eyes. He couldn't see that again. She could finally relax now. So he said, watched people leave. Watched people look at him, and maybe they wondered what he was doing. The ever-present ache in his throat just seemed to get worse as it got darker. It seemed like time had passed so quickly, no one had even bothered to ask why he hadn't left. The teachers were gone. Kaken was gone. Everyone was gone. He tugged his bag back over his shoulders, walking up to the front of the school and slipping the key into the lock. Of course, everything he was doing was going to be caught on grainy cameras from the school's security system, but he didn't mind now. Izuku felt like a ghost, entering the dark hallways with just moonlight from the abundance of windows. It was like he couldn't even think, and his body just kept climbing the stairs one by one. Finally, he'd reached the door to the roof. His hands shook so hard he dropped the key on the floor, and he had to pick it back up again to unlock the metal door. The sound was so loud. He was outside. It was dark, the moonlight's soft glow out over the roof as his footsteps seemed to be the loudest thing in his ears, even if he could hear the cars on the road a bit away from him. He felt like he didn't even know how he made it this far. Dropping the keys to the ground, he fell on his knees, sobbing out so loud it rang in his own ears. His hands were tangled in his messy curls again, as he furiously made sounds from the back of his throat. He wanted to bash his head over and over again on the edge of the roof. Izuku was hysterical, his mind a torrent of flowing feelings and his body shaking and screaming at him for being so worked up. He smacked his hands out on the edge of the roof with another loud sob. Curling his hand into a fist, he repeatedly started smashing it into the edge until it burned more than his mind did. He finally stopped, he stopped crying, and he was just breathing, looking down at the ground, eyes barely seeing with the tears flooding them. He never seemed to run out of them. Rolling his body over, he sat up. Grabbing the bottom and side of his bright red sneaker, he pulled it off. He did the same with the other one, holding them in his hands while he stood. He couldn't imagine how pathetic he looked now, a quirkless freak with no place here. He just couldn't handle it anymore. He couldn't handle his thoughts, how his mom looked at him, how everyone looked at him. Definitely not how his hero looked at him so apathetically while he left him on top of a roof. He placed his messy sneakers near the edge, the toes of the shoes pointing out towards the end of the roof. Stuffing a hand into his pocket, he pulled out a couple pieces of folded paper. With a horribly pathetic sound coming from him, he placed them inside his shoes. Izuku pressed his bare foot to the top of the small barrier on the edge of the roof. His heart seemed to squeeze so hard that a few more tears fell down his face. His stomach seemed to do flips at the thought. but his mind seemed set. He didn't want to live like this anymore. There was no future for him. What if he did get a quirk in the next life? Wouldn't that just be better than anything he could achieve here? With that thought, he pulled himself up over the edge. Both feet curling into the rock, and he almost shivered at the feeling. He looked to the side at his backpack, all might pins decorating the front. It just squeezed his heart again. He raised his fist slightly in utter defeat. Plus ultra. He muttered under his breath. Skiing in air, he closed his eyes, arms dangling beside him. Then he jumped. The fall was blood rushing for a moment. Just a moment. Then could hear a loud bone-breaking crack and a half-second of overwhelming pain. Before his eyes seemed to white out. His mind suddenly felt relief. Inko Midoriya got home quite late that night. It had started raining and she was already drenched. She reached down and quickly took her shoes off before placing them at the front. Dropping her bag on the kitchen table, she had wrapped it in a grocery bag as not to get her things wet earlier. Slicking a piece of hair back that was sticking to the front of her face, she quickly headed to the shower. She had already made quite a mess on the floor and wanted to get the shower done so she could get to sleep. She was so tired. Her head kept dropping in the shower and she was out and dressed into a nightgown a little faster than usual. Rubbing her eyes, she turned the lights off and headed to her bedroom. Izuku's door was shut and she looked at it for a moment with a deep sigh. Inko just wanted her son to be happy, to get all the things he deserved in life that other people wouldn't let him have. She was just so worried for him. He barely talked to her yesterday and she didn't even get to talk to him about it because she got home so late. Reaching her hand for the door knob, she sighed. Pulling it back and clutching the top of her nightgown. Izuku was a light sleeper, she couldn't wake him up. Besides, she was about to fall asleep on the floor herself. So with one last look at the door, she walked into her room and fell into a heap on her bed. Barely able to cover herself with her blanket before she was out like a light. Inko was awake at 3:30 in the morning. She was gasping, eyes quickly opening and pulling the blanket off her like it burned. Something finally occurred in her bleary mind that she couldn't think of before. A deep feeling in her chest of despair like no other. Izuku's shoes weren't at the front door last night. Her heart dropped like a weight. She was up as fast as she could and slamming her door open. Her mind filling with a million horrible ideas. She was barely holding back tears, already praying to God that Izuku was here and maybe he put his shoes in the wash. Never in her life has she opened the door on her teenage son without knocking, but she did now. Throwing the thing open as if her life depended on it. And maybe it did. Izuku was her life, her everything. She was over to the bed in an instant. It was made cleanly like she had taught him, but there was no Izuku, no tuft of green hair peeking out from under the covers. Just the sight made her burst out into tears as she frantically looked around his room for any sight of him. His backpack was not in his room. "Izuku!" she yelled, voice wobbly as she quickly made her way out of her son's room. "Baby, this isn't funny, Izuku!" she yelled again, her voice cracking. She ran all over the house in a state of absolute panic to try and find him. He wasn't in any of the rooms. She knew he wasn't a little kid, he didn't go hide in a closet for fun anymore. When she couldn't find him anywhere, she fell into a kitchen chair with loud, drenching sobs. She just couldn't think positive. Her son would have said something, would have called her, would have done something. In her chest, she could just feel it, like something was terribly wrong. Quickly pulling her bag open, she fumbled with her phone. Immediately dialing the talk was filled with heart-wrenching sobs and Inko begging for help. She knew her baby was in trouble. He didn't do things like this. The lady on the other side of the phone tried her best to get all the details and calm Inko down with breathing exercises, but it barely worked. "I know something's wrong," she hiccuped through her tears. It would be an hour later before they were knocking at her door. She couldn't help but hope. It was like a light popped up in a dark tunnel and hope shined through her when she opened the door. She quickly started asking questions before they could get a word out. "Oh my goodness, did you find him? Is he okay?" She sounded almost like she was begging, and it made the men on the outside of her door hearts clench. She was trying to look over their shoulders to see if Izuku was behind them. They asked to come in, and all Inko could say was yes. They seemed to get her to sit on the couch while they stood in front of her. She knew what was happening, but she just couldn't find the right place in her brain to realize it. A teacher found your son on the side of the school building. His voice was in such a somber tone that Inko couldn't even bring herself to speak up. He jumped off the roof and died from the impact. We found his shoes, backpack and suicide notes at the top. I am so sorry, Mrs. Midoriya. Her heart seemed to stop, maybe for a whole minute it felt like. What? Her mind seemed to fog up just to protect her from the news. She let out a stuttering sound before she was screaming, sobbing, curling up into herself as she clutched her chest with white knuckles. Her baby, her everything. He couldn't be gone. He just couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to even ask the question, "Are you sure it's him?" because she couldn't bear for the police officer to confirm it for her again. They let her cry, watching her closely to see if she would need medical help. She was just sitting there sobbing. The full front of it was not quite hitting her yet, but she knew it would soon. "We need to ask you some questions. It will really help," the other man said, gently sitting beside her and waiting for her to be calm enough to get information. With bleary eyes, it took her another minute to be able to talk, tears still falling down her face and a hole in her heart. "I'll try," she said quietly. She just wanted to be with her son. The police had left after softly questioning her, setting a time the next day to help her with everything she needed to sign and get done since she was alone. They knew she was very shaken up and probably couldn't do it on her own quite yet. Inko sat on her couch, looking like she got run over by a car. Her mind foggy and barely working. Hand clutched over the top over her shirt, knuckles still white. Her baby, even more tears seemed to rush out like waterfalls. And after just crying and crying, she couldn't handle being alone anymore with her thoughts. She didn't want to look at anything and think of her baby when she saw them. Pressing the phone to her face, she waited for someone to pick up. Bakugo Katsuki entered his kitchen with a grumpy look on his face, practically falling into a chair and breathing out a sigh as he glanced over to the old hag who had made breakfast for him. "Hey brat." "School's cancelled." She dropped the plate down in front of him. An omelet placed in the center of it. "What? Why?" he growled out, eyes glancing out the window. Yeah, it was sprinkling a little bit, but definitely not enough to get him out of school. Picking up his fork, he shoved a large piece of the omelet into his mouth, not showing the grin that wanted to appear on his face from his mother's spicy cooking. "They didn't say. Just eat your breakfast. You have time to do your chores now that you have a day off." Katsuki made a sound that was almost a growl. Fing chores, he wasn't gonna be a maid. He had to use the extra time to train. But the absolutely terrifying look in his mother's eyes told him not to even think about saying no. So he grumbled something and shoved more egg in his face. Suddenly the chimey ringtone of the old hag's phone went off. She picked it up and he could see a small smile on her face when she pressed the button to answer. Immediately the smile fell, even Katsuki could hear the heart-wrenching sobs coming from the speakers on her phone. As his mom moved into the hallway to talk, he couldn't help but know who was on the other side of that phone. Auntie Inko. Even he knew what a wonderful person she is. So to hear her cry like that was a little shock. That something sounded wrong. Of course, she had always cried a lot, but nothing like that before. Swallowing his food down dryly, he couldn't help but feel something heavy sit in his chest. It was a feeling he despised. His mother was using her soft voice, asking what was wrong and seemingly trying to get something out of Inko that wasn't tears. And then she went quiet. The only sound in the house was Katsuki chewing as quiet as he could while Inko seemed to sob even louder than before. Even he cared a little bit about whatever the F was going on. He kept glancing over to her while he ate. A small heat in his chest, expanding as he waited for something to happen. He couldn't see his mom's face, but he could hear how shaky her voice was. It was a shock. She never sounded like that. He swallowed another lump in his throat as he looked fully at his mother in the hallway. She seemed to be trying to calm Inko down and ask her questions, which he couldn't hear the answers of. And the longer it lasted, the more the burning in his chest expanded. "We can come over. We will help you with whatever you need, all right." Her tone was soft but wobbly, and after a few more seconds she hung up the phone. Katsuki watched as his mother turned around, his heart sinking down to his stomach as he looked at her face. She was crying, really crying. He couldn't even think of the last time he'd seen her actually cry. Her eyes puffy and ruining her work makeup. She wiped at them with her hands, but she seemed to wheeze out a harsh sound and more tears fell down her face. It was a horrible feeling watching his always so strong mother cry like that. He couldn't even think about what happened. He was so bewildered. He didn't know what to do. Sure, they hugged, but he never had to deal with comforting her. "What's going on?" he asked without saying "old hag" or swearing for once. His tone wasn't that much better, but at least it wasn't rough. He placed his fork down as he looked at her with a bit wider eyes than normal. Something really must have effing happened if she was crying. It really hadn't hit him yet what could be the cause. He was a smart boy, but his mind seemed to block out a couple possibilities. He just couldn't even think of them. She moved the hair out of her face, wiping at her tears again, and opened her mouth a little to speak. It took her a second, but her voice came out a little wobbly. "Izuku jumped off the school building last night. Inko just found out. He's dead." She closed her mouth again, wiping at her eyes. Katsuki looked at her like she was insane, eyes wider than they have ever been. He felt almost nauseous, his chest burning and throat pulsing with the urge to start crying. Guilt seemed to cover his whole body like laying under a Fenji piano. Without even noticing it, he was shaking, eyes gleaming as his open lips quickly turned up into a scowl. "You're effing lying." He was on the edge of screaming. Anger rose up with every other emotion he was feeling. It was chaos. He had stood up without even knowing it, palms burning already with the urge to blow something the F up. She looked just as angry in a split second. "I'm not lying, you effing brat," she yelled at him, her voice breaking as she suddenly grabbed her son and pulled him into a crushing hug. She couldn't imagine losing her brat, ever. Katsuki was shocked with what she said, with what she did. It just hit him. And he was wrapping his arms around his mother tightly, letting a sob escape from his throat. He didn't want to let them out, but tears started flowing down his cheeks. He clutched the back of her shirt and he wanted to effing scream. That, always following him around, right on his heels and mumbling into his ear about whatever he was interested in that day. Which hero, quirk, or crime news he most wanted to babble about. They were inseparable, even though Katsuki didn't want to admit it. Even so young, he always wanted Izuku with him. Even after he got his quirk, Deku was the same. Even after Deku realized he would never get one, he still followed Katsuki around. Katsuki would never say it, but he was a shitty kid. At the beginning of middle school they seemed okay for a while. Not as close, but Deku was always trying to be near him, talking and babbling like he always did. Even at the beginning people started making fun of Deku or making him the outcast just because he was quirkless. Pathetically, Katsuki did nothing to stop them. Another year passed and then he was having trouble with Deku. A kind of trouble he didn't even understand. It just started out as another day. He would start feeling things in his chest he's never felt before. He felt himself looking at Deku in a way he never bothered to. It made him so angry. Thoughts that Deku was cute, that he didn't want the nerd to cry, that he wanted to be closer to him like they were before, but better. It was confusing, and every time he looked at those cute plump cheeks dotted with gorgeous freckles he wanted to scream. People started dating, saw people kissing in the hallways or holding hands, and even though he would rather blow an explosion on himself than think about it, he felt as if he wanted to do those same things with the FNG nerd. Every time he even got a glance it felt like his heart was on fire and it infuriated him. It just fell from there. He got farther away, insulting Deku when he wanted to compliment him and pushing him around when he wanted to pull him in. It was an endless cycle of anger and crushing guilt that he didn't even understand. Even more time passed and Deku still didn't seem to get the hint that Katsuki needed him to get the F away so he would stop thinking so weirdly. It wasn't until he realized something that their relationship took a turn for the worse. It was near the end of the school day. He had detention for some reason and he headed outside to finally go home. He can remember exactly what he saw that day. A couple of boys had another one up against the brick wall. The one holding him down with some kind of lowly strength quirk. He only looked at them for less than a minute, but it still was enough to hit him hard. "You're FING disgusting. FNG fgot." one of the boys seemed to say as he kicked the other straight in the stomach, and Katsuki flinched when he heard the sharp groan come from the one against the wall. You shouldn't even be alive. Freak. And what? You think I'm handsome too? He growled out, pulling the boy's face close to his own before spitting straight over his nose and pulling away. They dropped him, and before Katsuki could figure out how hard they were gonna beat the F out of the dude, he was already gone. It was disgusting. Wasn't he supposedly going to be a hero? He was up all night, thinking about what happened. Maybe something in his brain just clicked and he felt scared. What if someone found out about what he felt? What he was thinking? His whole reputation would be ruined. People would look at him like he was FNG mud and he wouldn't get the time of day. Sure, he called everyone extras, but he was fueled by praise and the people around him liking him or being intimidated by him. He didn't want to look weak. The next day was even worse. Deku following him into class. They had only started the school year a week ago, but people looked at him weirdly when they saw Deku trailing around him and being so hero-loving when he didn't even have a quirk. It set him off. It was a battle between what he thought he wanted and what he actually wanted. And what one was being to the only person that wasn't family he actually cared about. The only person that he felt so weirdly about. He just sat in his seat, jaw clenched as Deku went to sit a couple seats in front of him and to the side. Deku had already opened his books and looked at the teacher like he was about to spit out the word of God. What the teacher spit out was what FNG propelled Katsuki into being worse than before. A FING villain. It was group projects, the teacher's pick of course. Katsuki ended up with some random guy he knew nothing about other than he had a worthless long finger quirk. Deku ended up with the new girls this year, and of course he blushed like an idiot when everyone had to move to sit by each other and start the idiotic project. Katsuki found himself glancing back over to Deku more than what was acceptable. He was barely paying attention to the work, when he would usually be glued to it so he could keep his spot at the top of the class. Deku was smiling like an idiot the whole time, hands waving and face redder than a tomato. He acted as awkwardly he possibly could with the girl who just giggled and seemingly helped Deku with the work, who was too flustered to do it himself. Like he FNG needed the help, the BSturdy was always top of the class right beside him. He was pressing the pencil so hard to the paper it broke in two. He mumbled, finally looking away from Deku for a moment. He didn't know why, but his chest felt like it was burning. He could barely control his face. Why was Deku acting like Effie? He never did that around Katsuki. It was a hard time getting through class when he kept breaking pencils and barely not crying even though he didn't realize he needed to. It took way too long, but the bell rang and Deku was a little slower on making his way over to Katsuki, only fueling his anger. They ended up by each other by the lockers. Deku's face tinted pink still, and he had a stupid little grin on his face that made Katsuki's heart squeeze. Wasn't she so pretty? He gushed out like a schoolgirl, blushing as he said so. Sorry, she was just so nice. I don't think a girl has been that nice to me before. And she had an awesome quirk, it was Dash. He began talking about the random girl like she was the most interesting thing in the FING world. Katsuki couldn't help but scowl and think about how better he was than that girl in every way. After a few seconds, everything seemed to hit him. The fact that he didn't want to be seen as disgusting, that Deku made him feel so angry and weird every time he looked at him, and that for a FANG fact. Deku was straight. He'd always got flustered around basically any girl. Deku would never look at him with that flushed red face unless he was thinking about some girl. It made him almost nauseous. He couldn't even remember one time that he looked at a girl and felt like that. Or even felt attracted. And that scared him. Really scared him. Get the F out of my way, Deku. Stop the mumbling. The tone of his voice was so harsh this time Deku actually flinched. Kaken, what's wrong? He asked, eyes all big and worried. Just the look made Katsuki's heart clench so hard he wondered how it didn't break. And that feeling just brought on more anger towards the big-eyed softy. It just happened, he shoved his arm into Deku's shoulder and exploded. Deku fell back into the ground and let out a sharp cry. Hand coming up to clutch at his shoulder where the fabric had been burned and some of the skin had reddened darkly. He was already curling in on himself, biting down on his lip to hold the pain. Just looking at Deku, tears in his eyes and in pain made Katsuki so sick. Don't if they come near me. He growled out before leaving as fast as he could. He knew tears were building up and he just had to leave. That's when it really ended. They grew away, and Katsuki got more angry and hateful. Horrible to Deku even though he didn't want to be. Just so confused, and he was taking it out on the only one he liked. After the one time he never used his quirk on Deku again. Just making sparks to scare him a little bit. And then he got people following him and they seemed to enjoy hurting the nerd more than Katsuki ever could. The torment he put that nerd through daily was fang sick. Yesterday, the writing on the desk, how could he let that ifing happen? That was way too fang far. How could he not stand up for him, stand by him? How could he watch the boy sit there, tears in his eyes and that look? That fang horrible look. But he was weak. He was scared. He was fing coward. Every horrible word that came out of his mouth he didn't mean. He knew Deku wasn't worthless. Telling him he couldn't be a hero was the truth. He couldn't be a hero, he would die within the first 5 minutes. Deku listened to his bullshit anyway and killed himself. Katsuki was pathetic, he knew that. Clutching on to his mom like he was a little kid again when he got too scared at a movie on the TV. Everything he never let himself feel, he was feeling it. His body racked with sobs and his hands burned into the cloth of his mother's jacket. The news had just hit him so hard he felt like he was in shock. Still, it didn't seem fully register yet. Katsuki! His mother's rough tone pulled him out of it. He immediately ripped his hands away from her. The smell of burning cloth in the air. She was shucking off her jacket and throwing it in the sink. It was more than just a little singed. He was breathing heavily, the tears seemed to stop for a moment but he was shaking. Staring at his mother with wide eyes like he didn't even understand what was going on. She was moving towards him, hand on his shoulder and sighing softly. Her eyes just gleamed with tears and maybe a bit of shock. After all, it made her heart ache with worry over how Katsuki was taking it. Katsuki, it's all right. Snap out of it. She gently shook his shoulder. Maybe he didn't realize it, but he was panicking. And when he stared hard in his mother's eyes, all the guilt seemed to rush back instead of the overwhelming panic. He looked away quickly, falling into his chair and pressing his hands onto legs, clutching them like they were gonna fall off. Maybe Mitsuki didn't expect this much of an outburst. It pained her, but she knew the boys didn't get along anymore. After all, Izuku never came over anymore. She hasn't even heard anything about him unless it came from Inko. Every time she would bring up the name it was like Katsuki despised to even hear it. Katsuki was stared hard at the table, breathing heavily and face paler than a sheet. It was just a million things rushed over his head at the same time and he couldn't even look over at her. Guilt was painted on his face in splatters. His whole body felt heavy, a spiral of it in his stomach that physically hurt. Maybe his eyes shone what he was feeling, or maybe it was mother's instinct, but she somehow knew something happened. Katsuki felt like he couldn't breathe. He just shook his head like he was in denial. Denial that he caused this. Denial that Deku wasn't at home in his All Might-themed bed and writing away in that stupid journal of his. Katsuki. Her voice had a hard edge to it now. She wasn't crying anymore, but her eyes seemed almost hard in a way that was so real. And not as playful as her everyday look. It was like she was thinking hard for a moment. And her heart clenched at the thought, but she just had to say it. She could almost feel it. What did you do? The line was accusatory but also almost soft in a way, like she didn't even want to hear the answer. And just hearing it made Katsuki want to vomit. She was standing beside him, hand clenched over her chest and eyes burrowing holes into his head. He still couldn't look at her. The letter came out with a rough choking sound. Eyes squeezing out tears as he clenched his teeth. His face was absolutely dismal. It was over. It didn't matter now. He couldn't hide anything. I told him to jump. The words were stammered, full of absolute anguish at hearing it aloud. He shut his mouth tightly, teeth clenching down. He couldn't get another word out. The dread of how his mother would react didn't hit as hard. He felt like he deserved it. Maybe it was because he didn't expect it. Or maybe it was because it was full of actual hate, but it hurt like hell. His head whipped to the side so hard that he fell with the chair. His back shot up a sting of pain from the side of the chair digging into him, but that was nothing compared to the absolute feeling of hurt. It wasn't as much as the slap as that it was done. His mom slapped him around a little from time to time, but never like this. Clutching his hands up over his face, he just sobbed. The pain of a parent, his mom feeling so disgusted by him, was almost the worst pain in the world. This is what he was trying to get away from, but oh, he was just building it up instead, wasn't he? He was 4 again. Sobbing on the floor because he'd accidentally hurt himself with his quirk. Just like then, his body racked with sobs as he covered his face, almost to hide it. It was more to hide him now. He couldn't bear to look at his mom. He knew he was usually so strong. It was pathetic how he looked now. Mitsuki was crying again. Looking at her son on the floor sobbing was like a dagger piercing through her heart. She hadn't seen him like this in such a long time. Even if her hand burned and she never wanted to see him cry ever, she was so angry. She just couldn't even fathom this. She didn't know how to react, what to do. This wasn't in the FING parenting books that Masaru forced her to read. She could see him hurting, but Izuku was dead. She didn't know the story, but she understood that Katsuki probably hasn't been nice for a long while. Not like he ever was, but there's a fine line between just personality and FING making someone want to die. She still didn't know what to do. Quickly wiping her tears away, she slowly sat on the floor beside him. He jumped when she laid a hand on his shoulder and just softly ran it up and down his upper back. She can't remember a time they were so affectionate and she missed it. She wasn't glad by what this was caused by. Katsuki was still covering his face. He expected for his mother to just leave, but it was a relief when she stayed beside him even when he didn't deserve it. "I will always love you, brat. You know that." She sighed softly, running a hand up through her hair and shaking her head. "I don't know what happened. I don't know what's going on. But what I do know is Inko is in FANG hysterics and I need to be there for her. I can't deal with your shit right now. So get your butt up, get dressed so we can go help her." Her words seemed harsh, but that was normal for them. That's how they were. His mom had left him to go get ready. It was almost like a daze as he pushed into his room and put on whatever was clean, rubbing his face with his arm as he got the guts to walk out of his room. His mom stood there, eyes somber as she turned away to open the door. He just followed her, stomach swirling with anguish at every step. When they arrived there, it felt unreal. He hadn't been here in such a long time. He really wanted to throw up off of the railing. "You have to tell her about it," his mom whispered to him, hand reaching up to knock at the door. "You need to apologize." That's all Mitsuki could say. What could you say when your son looked so devastated and you didn't even know what was going on? She wished she knew, but she didn't have time to leave Inko alone. The words seemed to swirl in Katsuki's stomach. He sucked a deep breath in, holding his chin high as his body screamed at him to get the F away from what was about to be an utter downfall. Just seeing the door was enough. And when he watched the door open, he expected to see a green tuft of hair and big eyes that just seemed to hold the stars. "Kaken!" It rang in his ears like a bell. He could just feel tears flooding his eyes. What he saw was a sobbing Inko falling into his mom and hugging her like her life depended on it. Just hearing it on the phone was nothing close to seeing it in real life. He was barely holding on already and the guilt was crushing him. All he could do was stand there. He didn't deserve to try and act like he was innocent. Mitsuki held her tightly, rubbing her thumb into Inko's back and sighing. She knew it wouldn't help to say, "I'm sorry," because losing your baby, nothing can help that. Mitsuki pulled Inko into her house, Katsuki not falling far behind. He shut the door, face clenched into what looked like the worst fake scowl he's ever done. Inko wiped at her eyes, giving a soft, sad smile up at Mitsuki. Her voice was cracked and messed up, but she still tried to speak. "Thank you for coming." Mitsuki nodded at her and smiled softly. Then, like an angel she was, she smiled even bigger as she reached out her arms to Katsuki. Before he could even react, he was grabbed into the most comfortable hug he's ever had. He couldn't do it, he couldn't take that kind of kindness. Shaking his head ever so slightly, his body was suddenly racked with gut-wrenching sobs. His arms stayed strongly near his sides, not wrapping around her. I'm so sorry, he blubbered out. His strong demeanor ruined as he just wailed. IFING killed him. IFING did it. I told him to jump. IFING did it. Before Inko got a chance to, he wrenched his body away from her, arms coming up to cover his face again. He expected something, he really did. Nothing seemed to come. Inko was shaking, hand over her mouth as she seemed to try and realize something. To connect the dots. She just shook her head like she couldn't believe it, wrapping an arm around herself and staring at the boy who was hyperventilating. She had never in her life seen Katsuki like this. Even as a kid he was so strong. It was just a shock. She knew they had grown apart, but she didn't expect something like this. She didn't expect her baby to die. With a choking sound she looked up at Katsuki with wide eyes. Are you the one who gave him the bruises? She asked softly. There wasn't even an inch of anger in the words. Just a tone that ripped his heart to shreds. How could she not be screaming at him? He shuddered in a deep breath. His hands still clenched over his face and he shook his head. No, I didn't. He hadn't hit Deku. God, even through all his anger he never wanted to do that again. I didn't protect him either. His voice cracked harshly, was eating a hole. I made his everyday hell. The words were almost growled out. He was angry. So angry at himself. He just couldn't even think clearly over everything he felt. It was gut-wrenching. Inko looked up at him. Shaking a little, she slowly put her hand over Katsuki's shoulder. He is my baby. Everything. He adored you. All I remember is him following you around everywhere. He wanted to be just like you, Thun. She moved her hand away to wipe at her wet cheeks. He never did anything to you. The words weren't even cold. For some reason they were spoken softly, the stiff sad undertone still taking over it. Katsuki moved his hands, hiccuping as he looked away at the wall. IFING no. God damn it. His hands were heating up and he just couldn't take it. It was all crashing down on him and he just regretted everything. Everything. Deku's IFING saint. I was he just couldn't do it. Not yet, he couldn't try to explain himself. Not right now, pathetic excuses that didn't even make sense. I'm so effing sorry. Was all he could get out. Eyes still leaking like FNG sinks. He sunk down on the edge of the couch, his head hung low over his knees as he held them together with his arms. He couldn't breathe. He knew that only half of his feelings were hitting him and even now it was so much. He couldn't hold back anymore. God, his chest burned. He was so sorry. So angry, so FNG sad. He never appreciated what he had. Mitsuki squeezed her son's shoulder. A small sign of affection as she got up, wrapping an arm around Inko who was sobbing again. She led her down the hallway and into the bedroom. Katsuki was left alone. When his breathing calmed down he found himself looking up. Mind almost in a foggy daze as he looked around the room. He could still feel it, burning holes into him, but now it was like he couldn't let himself think about it anymore. Just for a little bit. He ended up staring at the ceiling. Enjoying the short time of letting his mind push out most of the feelings. He knew it wouldn't last long. Days had passed, just a few. Katsuki felt like he was in a dream state. Just wandering through his house all day or curling into his bed and staring at the wall. The weekend had passed by and he couldn't get out of bed on Monday. It was the first day of school he missed in what seemed like forever. He couldn't walk in there, sit there with his FNG school and have a half-butted memorial and a pathetic, no-bullying talk. They didn't FNG care. He knew most people in his class would walk around like nothing happened. Joke around like it was nothing. It didn't bother their life, so what did it matter? Just the thought of FNG seeing the school building made nausea push up against his throat. Was the sidewalk still splattered? Were they able to clean it up and act like it never happened? They were just upset because they knew they were gonna get there but hooped in court if Inko wanted to. Of course, she never wants to cause more trouble. He couldn't even think about when he had to go. He knew he couldn't do it. Walk through the hallways and pretend nothing happened, that Deku was never there at all? Just the thought of seeing an empty seat made his chest burn up. He was trying so hard to not feel like this. It wasn't the grief or dread. It was the feeling of being lovesick. Pathetic, so effing pathetic, he could just feel it, aching in his chest and up through his throat every time he thought of the dork's face. It didn't look like it to anyone else because he made sure it didn't, but he was FNG smitten. Smitten with the same boy he grew up with and bullied. Love was so hard to explain or understand. It was feeling he just couldn't place, and why he never stopped feeling it he didn't know. He still felt it pounding in his heart and messing up his head even after so long of trying to get rid of it. Katsuki forced himself up from the bed, patting down the rumbles in his dress shirt with a rough sound. Theofanji hated it. The tan dress breathes and white button-up that choked his already rough throat. He felt like he was headed to a wedding with the get-up. Inko decided they should wear white. Maybe to say what a good and bright person Deku was. Maybe it was just to torture him more. Ugh, God, he couldn't think about it right now. Smacking his hands over his face, he furiously rubbed them over his eyes. Fucking stop. He growled at himself, standing up straight instead of his normal hunch and puffing his chest out as that would somehow stop the swirling feelings in his stomach and the ache in his chest. Katsuki, hurry the f up. His mom's voice came. It wasn't the rough tone he was used to, a shred of what it usually was. He sighed in a deep breath, opening his door and stepping out into his house. The first thing he saw was his mother. She was wearing a completely white sundress? At least that's what he guessed it was. The sleeves stopped at her elbows and the bottom of it went just past her knees. Tan stockings and white wedges. God, she looked like she was going to a spring wedding. It almost made him want to puke. Stuffing his hands into the pockets of his horrible khakis, he looked over at his dad. His face was somber, wearing something close to what Katsuki wore. Maybe it was his imagination, but his dad didn't look at him as they headed out to the car. His fists were clenched tightly in his breathes as he walked out of the house. It was almost summer. The skies were pale blue and everything seemed to have its color back. It was all so green. It was an appealing day. Something he never really cared about. The car ride was uneventful. Bitter silence and a short stop at a flower shop. His heart caught in his throat as his mother swung the car door open and walked inside like she didn't expect anyone else to come in. Maybe he imagined this in his dreams. Stopping by a flower cart and picking out some of those pretty white flowers he didn't know the names of. Shoving them at Deku's chest and going, "Gee, these are for you." He could just see the dork blush all the way to his ears and hold them in his hands like they were precious. Kaken, he would squeal and cover his face like he always did when he got too embarrassed. He huffed out, grabbing at the handle on the door and stepping out of the car with purpose. He couldn't help but slam it shut as he slouched off to follow his mother inside. His mother was there, standing at a shelf and staring at the flowers like she didn't know what to do. He could tell with how glossy her eyes were that she was having trouble. Standing beside her, he sighed softly. Examining the choices, he pointed to some white ones. "I think he'd like those," he hummed out softly. It was a wicker basket with no handles, full of different kinds of white flowers. He didn't know what Deku's favorite flower was or whatever, but he remembered when he and Deku were small, looking for frogs, Deku would stop every time he saw some white blooming weeds and pluck them out to hold while they searched. She looked at him for a second, a weird look on her face before she gave him a faint smile. Picking up the medium-sized basket and nodding at him slowly. He just looked away and made a low sound as he eyed the bouquets on the other side of the small store. What was going through his mind? He didn't really know. But as Mitsuki was headed over to check out, he moved over to them. There were many to choose from, but he was staring at one in particular. It had white cloth wrapped in the middle of flowers to hold them together. They were white, and even though the bouquet was small, he liked it. Maybe there were 7 of the white flowers in total. He picked it up, staring at it hard for a moment before he was right beside his mom at the small wooden counter where a young woman sat on a stool. He wouldn't let himself even think of why he picked them up, even if it was just for a little while. Mitsuki stared at what was in her son's hands for a whole 3 seconds before she decided not to say a word. If that's what he wanted to get, she wasn't gonna tell him that it was a wedding bouquet. The girl at the counter gushed, smiling widely and entering the prices into her calculator. "Weddings are so amazing," she giggled, smiling up at Katsuki and his mother. "I hope you two have a great time." Katsuki's eyebrow twitched. Usually he'd be screaming at her for assuming they were going to a Demon wedding. It blurred in his head with anger at just the thought. Before Mitsuki could even get a word out, Katsuki was already on it. "It's a FNG funeral," he hissed, clenching his teeth down hard as he clutched his flowers. The glare in his eyes could melt ice. For once, Mitsuki didn't say a word to him as she handed over the money. Picking up her basket, she watched as the girl stumbled with what to say. Bakugou was already angrily stomping out of the shop and into the car. "It's fine," she sighed as she left the shop without her change. Katsuki was fuming silently in the back. Holding the bouquet in his lap, fingers clutched over the middle. Hard but not too much to ruin them. Mitsuki climbed back in, the wicker basket in her lap as Masaru started the car and headed off. It was a short drive to the cemetery. It was a large one, green grass and sidewalks where a couple people seemed to be walking. They parked and the silence was deafening. Katsuki was the first one out of the car, staring hard at the field of green grass and potted flowers. It was too FNG pretty to be a graveyard. He slammed the door shut, already feeling his breath shortening. God, he didn't want to think about it. He shook his head hard for a moment. His dad getting out of the car and slipping his keys in his pocket. Then, he was looking at Katsuki with those FING solemn eyes. Reaching out his hand to squeeze Katsuki's shoulder like he was the one that needed comforting. He pulled his shoulder away roughly, not even looking back at him. Mitsuki sighed as she watched. "Come on." She gently handed over the basket to her husband and headed up the main sidewalk through the black gated entrance. Her hands were clutched together at the front of her body, knowing she had to keep her arms free to comfort Inko. Katsuki followed close behind her. One hand still clutched over the flowers and held out to his side. His eyes kept glancing around at all the DMN gravestones, ranging in sizes and shapes. He already wanted to throw up. He could feel his shoulders bouncing as he tried to get his breathing in place. And then after not even a minute they were there. A small patch of green that was freed up. The first thing he saw was the tan foldable chairs that were lined up at the beginning of the patch. Just 3 small rows. In front of the rows was a small white stage, if you could even call it a stage. It was just a medium-sized wooden platform with a white sheet covering it. A podium on the top of it off to the edge that had a microphone. There was a white sheet behind the platform that was held up by some kind of flimsy stand that would count as a screen for the projector that sat off to the side. And on the left, Katsuki felt his throat close up and he didn't feel like he could breathe. It was like it hadn't fully hit him until now. There was the FING coffin, sitting next to a newly dug hole with a little white canopy over it. It was just white wood, the coffin. It was closed already, the top covered with an arrangement of yellow, blue, and red flowers. Really? Benji, really? He almost wanted to laugh. His father had to push him over to the patch of death because he couldn't FING work his legs by himself. And then, there was Inko, already sobbing again as she fell into Mitsuki's arms. She just held her, rubbing her back and sighing into her shoulder. There was a man standing behind them, hands clasped together like he didn't know what to do with them. He was tall, short raven curly hair with brown eyes and freckles dotting his entire face. He was dressed about the same as he and his father were. And for just a moment of staring hard at the man, he finally figured out who the F it was. It had to be Deku's FNG dad. Of course he would show up to his son's funeral. Katsuki's only seen him once in his life, and it was brief. He barely even remembered it. It just made him angry looking at the man, the freckles, and the fact this man was not in the nerd's life. Katsuki's chest just burned when he looked his way because he knew the man hadn't been to one single event in Deku's life and now he was here for the very last one. His dad didn't seem to care as he stepped in front of Katsuki to shake the man's hand and offer a, "I'm sorry for your loss" spiel. So, Katsuki was just left standing there, looking around as he breathed heavily. Left arm clutched around himself, the other still holding the flowers. He just couldn't look at the coffin. It burned. It ached like he got ran over. He fell into a chair on the front row, clutching his empty hand over his chest and trying to get his breathing in check. His eyes screwed up as he could already feel the tears fighting to get out. It was everything: grief, dread, despair, regret, guilt and the feeling of being so FNG heartbroken. It was swirling in a cocktail of FNG pain, pushing up through his whole body so it would FNG hurt. He really wanted to scream, to sob, blow something the F up. He knew it was just pathetic, but he rocked back and forth in the uncomfortable foldable chair. AFING foldable chair, didn't Deku deserve more than this? Deku was FING dead. FING dead because of him. Because he couldn't get his sheet together and be caring. He acted like FNG coward and he was so FANG weak. Tears were already dripping down his face. God, he regretted everything. Every FNG thing. He wished he could tell Deku how he felt or even that he was just so effing sorry. A hand was gently placed on his shoulder, and someone was kneeling beside him. His eyes slowly looked over to see Inko there, moving her hand to squeeze his knee. She looked so devastated, but she gave him a small smile. His face was a wreck, eyes red and features twisted into an ugly agonized look. Don't if he try to dash, his voice wobbled. Moving his hand up to wipe at his tears and shake his head. His head was still hanging, God he couldn't do this. Inko softly sighed. She didn't understand him. She didn't think she ever could unless she got some type of explanation, but she could never hate. Especially when the boy was clearly so sorry. Katsuki. She croaked, voice so worn down from all her tears. He was shaking his head again and she just rubbed his knee gently. You can do this. She just gave him the encouragement, almost talking to herself as well. Then, she was up and sitting down in a chair beside him, saving seats in between her for Katsuki's parents. There could be no viewing or wake. The body was too damaged for an open coffin. So the service was just happening all at once. She wiped her tears with a tissue as she looked up at the screen. The man that was holding the funeral was now standing on the small platform, waiting for everyone to take their seats so he could start. Katsuki grabbed a tissue from the box that was gladly under his seat. Wiping his face and crumpling it up in his hand. He forced himself to look up. Breathing in air like he hadn't in a very long time. Felt himself turning his head around, noticing the people that were there. It was almost empty except for them. A coworker of Inko's and a couple of students from school. It almost made his chest bubble up with anger. How could she invite the kids at school to come to his DMN funeral? It was so FING sad that only 2 showed up and it seemed like they didn't even want to be here. Then, there was a man sitting on the edge of the last row. He was lanky with weirdly shaped blonde hair. The man clearly didn't get the FING memo because he was dressed in overly large black clothes. He looked almost on the edge of death, and Katsuki couldn't help but wonder who the F he was. He was looking straight ahead. The look on his face was full solemn determination. Katsuki decided he didn't care. He was here for one FNG person and that one person only. Clenching his left hand, he stared up at the man who began to talk. The drone of the beginning of every funeral about how the departed shouldn't have died and how he was too young and blah blah blah. Every FNG word made his inside swirl. This man didn't know a FING thing about Deku, other than was a dead kid and he got hired to come here and host. Yeah, everything the man was saying was true, it was just the fact that the host didn't care. The man finally stopped after Katsuki's ears were ringing and now it was time for the real torture to start. Music began playing softly out of a speaker on the side of the platform. The first image clicked on and he could feel his throat close up. It was Inko, skinny and young with a light in her eyes that was so bright it was blinding even through the picture. She was standing with a baby snuggled in her arms, wrapped up in a blue blanket. He was so small, just a tiny tuft of green hair. Freckles dotting the chubby baby cheeks, his eyes were just barely open in the picture, a gray that would turn green once he got out of being a newborn. Inko wailed as the picture popped up on the board. The sound was so effing horrible even Katsuki jumped a little in his seat, expression flinching for just a moment. Mitsuki had her arm wrapped around Inko's shoulders, just letting her cry into the top of her dress. Deku's effing dad didn't seem to try and comfort his wife, just staring at the screen like he was traumatized. Katsuki couldn't help but know that this was all his own FING fault. The next picture was another one of Deku as a newborn, but this time he was in his crib and his father was standing beside it. A gentle smile on his face as he looked at the camera. He couldn't help but look over at the man who was sitting on the other side of Inko. He was visibly biting down on his lip as he looked at the picture. Hands pressed together and fingers twitching around nervously. That was the only picture he was in. Unlike Deku's father, Katsuki was in almost every FANG other picture. The next one that popped up was a little caged-in area of carpeted floor. The little plastic bars that would keep babies from crawling around and poisoning themselves. Deku looked like he was only one, maybe two. Laid on his back and fingers clutching over a small teething ring that was half in his mouth. His eyes were bright and looking up, fascinated by the camera or the person who was taking the photo. God, there he was. Katsuki Bakugou in a red onesie and sitting up just a half a foot away from Deku. Caught in the middle of throwing a small alphabet block at some stuffed animal. Usually it would be embarrassing, but it just made him extremely nauseous. He laid the flowers in his lap as he moved his hands together, clenching them into fists and looking back up at the screen. His throat choked up as he kept watching. It was just pictures and pictures of him and Deku. From toddler, preschool and the beginning grades. Him and Deku holding hands on the first day of preschool with their little blue outfits. Him and Deku covered in mud at age 6, him and Deku at a playground. It just went on and on and on. Throughout staring at all the pictures, he had wrapped both arms around his midsection, squeezing as he clenched down on his teeth. It was so hard, seeing every single picture and remembering almost every single one. Each new wave of guilt washing over him like a tidal wave. After a while, Katsuki stopped appearing in the photos. Just a few more. Then the final one flashed, Deku smiling brightly and waving at the camera. An all-might hoodie on, it was after winter break, just months ago. It flashed again and now numbers showed up over his picture. 2005, he didn't know why, but just seeing those numbers pop up made his throat throb. He was crying again. Tears dripping down his face as he forcefully bit down on his lip to try and be as quiet as possible. His arms were wrapped around his midsection still, squeezing so hard that it hurt. The toast was up again, saying a few more words before he asked for people to come up and speak if they wanted to. The godforsaken pictures still up on the board. His mother was up first, letting Inko calm down and prepare herself to speak. She just talked about how sweet Deku was the whole time she knew him. Too young, saying she wished she could have helped. It was short, but it was sweet. She was wiping tears away at the end before she sat back down next to Masaru, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Inko waddled up, and before she could get up on the platform, the host smiled at her softly, holding out his hand. "May I?" he asked. Through Katsuki's absolute despair, he could think, "What the F dash?" for a second. Inko wiped another tear from her eye as he nodded, taking her hand in his. He closed his eyes for a moment before nodding at her with a small smile. Immediately Inko looked better, the tears weren't in her eyes anymore. You could still see the sadness, but she wasn't crying. She took her hand away and thanked him quietly as she got up to the podium. Hands pressed together and picking at her nails nervously. "Izuku, my baby." She sighed out, looking down at her hands. Her voice sounded so much better. Katsuki finally understood it. Some kind of quirk that let people talk without sobbing their brains out. "I could never explain how much it hurts, and I wish he was still with me so I could help him. He was never a bother. I didn't know how horrible he felt, and I didn't do anything to try and make him feel better. I should have tried harder, done something." She glanced away, bottom lip trembling as she fumbled with the top of her white blouse. Izuku, I love you so much, and I'm sorry the world didn't understand you. You are so caring and sweet dash." Her voice seemed to crack, but the swirling tears in her eyes didn't fall. "You cared so much about others. You just wanted to save people. I'm so sorry this world didn't accept you, Izuku. There was never anything wrong with you, and I wish you understood that I never saw you as a bother." Then she closed her mouth, shutting her eyes tightly and shaking her head. "Izuku, baby, I'm so sorry." Finally the dam broke. She was wailing again, hugging herself and continuously shaking her head. The host seemed momentarily confused, before he helped Inko down and back to her seat, seemingly whispering to her before she shook her head. Mitsuki wrapped an arm around her gently as she shook. Katsuki watched the whole thing in abject horror. eyes wide and clenching his fists into his terrible khakis. The fact that Inko cried through a FING cork hit him like a train. Sure, she cried a lot, so did Deku, but it was never this gut-wrenchingly sad. Katsuki's palms were singeing the material over his knees as he watched the host walk back up. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? He asked softly, looking around at the tiny crowd and pressing his hands together. He didn't know what he was doing, but his body just got up, placing the flowers back in his seat as he shoved his hands deep in his pockets. He could feel all the eyes on him. It burned, but he even had to. He had his lips pressed together in a thin line of veiled anger. Climbing up the one crappy step up to the crappy platform, the DMN host was giving him those eyes that just read pity. Before he could even get up to the microphone, the host smiled softly at him and reached out his hand. Katsuki could feel his face contorting and he snarled, "No FNG way." The host was quickly off the platform after the heavy glare was sent his way. Standing off to the side on the grass, hands back together as he looked up politely, trying to change his face back to solemn and not confused. Mitsuki eyed her husband, him looking back just as concerned. Katsuki had always been a ticking time bomb, but they weren't even sure what was going to be said. She half expected him to say one sentence and slouch off. Masaru ran his thumb over her fingers. A quiet reassurance that Katsuki would take this seriously, just as he seemed to the whole day. Seeing his son cry that much in this short amount of time was shocking. Katsuki was always strong, always tough even when he didn't need to be. To say he didn't understand what was going on would be an understatement. All he knew was that this hit Katsuki hard, and they needed to be there for him even if he was a part of what happened. Katsuki stood in front of the podium, staring out at Deku's tiny crowd and pressing his teeth down hard on his lip. He was doing this right now in front of everyone, wasn't he? He was just gonna say it, say the DMN truth? What else could he do, hold it in and let it burn him up from the inside? No, it wasn't just about FNG him, it was about Deku. It was all about Deku. He'd fed up for a long time and he had to do this, become better, make it up in any way he could to him. God, he felt his chest heat up with anxiety, his hand coming up to clutch over the button up and CK in a breath of air. Would they understand? No, they wouldn't. Katsuki was so fed up and a coward that he did shit that wasn't even understandable. He felt himself glance over to his left where he had forced himself not to look since he came here. For Deku, he had to tell Deku. Not for anyone else, but he had to FNG apologize and just say what the nerd meant to him. That he was so FNG sorry. Where would he even start? He noticed a blue bird sat in a tree nearby and he smiled a little. Of course, a FING appealing day for a appealing person. Just, he had to imagine him again. He didn't even know how long he was standing there before he started or when a few tears slipped past his eyes. I'll never hear his voice again. He wasn't looking at them, he couldn't, he was looking at the white canopy and the flowers. One of his arms resting on the small top of the podium. You never know how good you had it till it's gone, right? His finger was rubbing against the wood as his eyes followed the wind going through the grass. It's all my fault. I know that. I will always know that I treated him like shit and all he did was stand there and take it. Then the next day he would follow me around like nothing had happened and everything was amazing. The tone almost ended in a growl. How could Deku be such a good person? How could he take so much over the years without getting a punch in? Oh Kakin, you're amazing, he mocked in a somber tone. But I'm FNG not. I'm a coward. I'm FNG weak. But he was perfect. Always so FING perfect. So FNG caring it made his head dizzy because he never deserved it. How did every time I looked at his face I saw red because ... He felt himself biting down on his lip, shaking his head as he got the nerve to continue. For Deku, he's talking to Deku. It would make me feel happy, bubbly maybe? It was so FNG confusing and I didn't like it. I had a reputation to uphold and apparently the whole school FNG hated Deku. I went along with it because I was FNG scared. Scared what they would think of me, that I wouldn't be the best anymore. He was shaking, tears blurring his eyes as he stared hard at the waving grass. His fingers clutching into the side of the wood. I'm a coward because I couldn't get my shit together and treat Deku like an actual human being. I should have protected him. Done anything other than what I did every day. And I never hated him. On the outside that's how I wanted it to look, but that he really was perfect. So nice it made my stomach sick. He made my head spin. He choked down a sound, trying not to think. Just tell him. I'm so sorry that I was scared, so scared because I didn't understand. I didn't want to feel that way, but I did. I do. I thought they would go away, leave me alone. They never did, of course. His hand was smoking, and he didn't care if he set the diamond podium on fire, he'd pay for it. He was breathing hard for a moment as tears streamed down his face. He cracked out a sob, eyes almost burning through the grass. I love him. I love him so much. The words were followed with what sounded like a mix between a pathetic wail and a bitter sound. I'm so sorry, Deku. He clenched the wood underneath his sizzling fingertips. He felt disgusting, but at the same time happy in a sad way. He'd let it out. All too late. He was finally being brave, and it didn't even matter anymore. Well, it mattered because he needed to apologize, wherever the hell Deku was, or if he was even anywhere at all. He had to say it. He didn't understand how it had gotten this far, to the point he was so scared of rejection, his feelings, his pride, and how people looked at him, that he would cause Deku to not even want to live anymore. Cause him to be in a coffin where his mother couldn't even have an open casket, cause he face planted into sidewalk. It felt like Katsuki himself pushed Deku off. He was so pathetic. He let go of the wood that now had clear burnt indents of fingers, taking his walk of shame back to his seat. He didn't look up, he just couldn't, not yet. He wondered how they felt about him now, Probably. Was he less of a man now? Gay, killer. He shook the thought out of his head. This wasn't about him. It was about Deku. He gently picked up the bouquet of flowers he didn't even know the name of, holding it tightly in his hand and slumping down in his chair. He was still looking at the grass, just enjoying the green as the continuous tears blotched up his face. It was absolute silence except of Katsuki's quiet sobs, the sounds of birds and the fresh air. Even the host was standing there dumbfounded for the longest moment before he carefully walked back up to the podium. Would anyone else like to say anything? He asked in an almost awkward tone. Through all his years of working, he's never heard anything quite like that. Dead silence followed his question, and he made a small hum in the back of his throat, starting the soft music again before he sighed out deeply. It's time to say goodbye to the departed. He was off his game now, forgetting what he was going to originally say, but he walked off motioning towards the coffin with an empathetic look spread across his features. Was sitting in her seat, almost dumbfounded by the speech, tears in her eyes as she stood. She didn't know what to think, what to say. But she knew that was all real, all truth. Her heart ached for Katsuki, but right now, it was her baby's time. She clutched her hands together as she waddled past the poor host, staring at the white coffin with big eyes. She moved her hand to press against it, muttering a prayer underneath her breath before pressing her forehead on the top and just staying there. She wished she could see him, see his face one last time. But she couldn't, and she couldn't even think of why. It hurt too much. Izuku, Mama loves you. She choked out, just holding herself there, like she was hugging him. It was still indescribable, the agony of losing the one person she cared most for. Her baby. She felt a large hand wrap around her shoulder, a body squishing next to hers, and she couldn't help but look up into her husband's eyes, the one she hasn't seen in years, and feel some sort of anger. It didn't last long before she noticed his tear-stained cheeks. I'm sorry, Inko. It was a croaked whisper. She reached her arm up to pull the taller man into a hug, letting out a sob as she shook against him. They stayed like that for a while before she tore herself away from the white wood, wiping her eyes repeatedly with the tissues her husband gave her as she stood at the end of the coffin, her husband's arm wrapped around her shoulders, standing with her. The few people that were there stood and moved to give their sympathy, maybe standing by the coffin for a moment. They left quickly, like they weren't even there. Inko watched a man she didn't know come up, tears in his eyes as he placed his hand on the side of her son's coffin, whispering something she couldn't hear. Then he was standing in front of her, eyes looking so somber as if he knew them. "I wanted to say I'm so sorry for your loss." His voice was just as somber as his eyes, and Inko felt the need to ask who he was, why he was here. But she just smiled sadly and thanked the old. He nodded at her before he was leaving. Katsuki's brain didn't seem to function, his chest burnt up with anxiety as he stayed in his seat, watching the feet of people come up and leave quickly. His mother and father hadn't moved beside him. He didn't understand, but he knew then he walked up there he would be a mess again, so he just waited for them to go first. They probably didn't wanna talk to him anyway. Mitsuki was the first to stand, pulling her husband up. They had been sharing looks this whole time and now they were sharing one again. Masaru tentatively reached his hand out, wrapping his fingers around his son's arm gently. "Come on, Katsuki," he said just as softly, quiet like Katsuki was young again, and he was too young to scream at his father. Katsuki felt himself choking on his own saliva, breathing out heavily as he shook his head repeatedly, shaking. Masaru's heart clenched, but he helped his son up, pulling him over to the coffin and standing there in front of Inko. His face moved into a look even he didn't understand. Worry mixed with sadness? He didn't know. Katsuki's heart clenched as he was being pulled over to the god-forsaken thing. Eyes wide, and his breathing was quickening as he stared at the thing. Deku was right there. Right there. He was barely holding himself up, his dad holding most of his weight like he was a child, and he didn't care. Mitsuki looked at her son and felt the urge to cry. It was heartbreaking seeing him like this. She in a deep breath as she reached her hand out over the coffin. She could remember him when he arrived at her house with Inko when they were young, tugging on the end of her dress as he bounced up and down asking where Kaken was. She smiled a little bit as she noticed the color of the flowers. It was just sweet. Then she was looking at Inko again. It just made her heart hurt all over again at her expression. Then she was hugging the life out of her. "I'm sorry." Inko just hugged her back, enjoying the comfort while she could. Katsuki was let go as his father reached out himself to touch the top, saying something under his breath Katsuki couldn't catch. He moved back over to his wife, standing there for support for both her and Inko. Katsuki's legs were shaking, still staring. Tears still dripping down his face as he reached his hand out, just holding it there, centimeters away. The end of his fingers shook, and he gulped for air before he was pressing his hand over the wood. Maybe he felt like as soon as he touched he would be struck down, but it just made his heart cry out in agony. His bottom lip quivered as he let out a restraining sob. His other hand pressed to the side of it and he was gone, sobbing like a newborn and pressing his face against the side. His flowers had fallen beside his knees and he didn't care for a moment. This was the closest he was ever gonna get to hugging Deku ever again. He couldn't even remember a time he had, maybe in preschool? Broken sobs pushed past his lips as he hyperventilated. He didn't even remember when he fell to his knees, but there he was, face shoved against the wood and letting out every feeling he'd bottled up since he can't even remember. He was never gonna see those freckles again. Those emerald green eyes, or the mumbling. He was never gonna hear Deku talk about stupid heroes ever again. He was careful to make sure his hands didn't fire up as he held them there. Suddenly someone was sitting on the grass beside him, wrapping an arm around him and trying to coddle him. It almost made him angry for a split second before he just let it happen, realizing it was Inko there, sobbing with him. It lasted for a little while, both of them sitting there and mourning. Then Inko was pulling him up, and his hands slid away from the wood, and it was almost like a shock of pain went through him. "Katsuki, they have to dash." She couldn't finish her sentence, but he understood. He picked up his flowers, clutching them in his hand. He looked at them for a second before pulling two out of the cloth, holding them together, pressing the stem into the other flowers on the top, along with the other one. He didn't know why, but he did. Inko pulled him away and he felt another hand on his shoulder. He clenched his eyes tight. He didn't want to see them. Then Inko was letting go of him and Mitsuki was pressing him into one of her crushing hugs that hadn't happened in a while. It was instant warmth from his mother and he just clutched her back, pressing his face into her shoulder and just staying there. He could feel bigger arms wrapping around both of them and he knew it was the old man. It made his heart happy, But he also felt sick. He didn't deserve it. But he just let himself have the comfort. He needed it. As much as he always said he didn't. He could hear it. They were lowering the coffin down. They held him as he shook. Why was he like this? So weak. They let him go seconds later and he said in a deep breath. He still couldn't look at them. He turned his eyes to the table where the coffin was. It was gone now. In its place there was a man using his quirk to fill the hole back up. It was done in maybe a minute and then it was patted down, just a dirt mound and the small tombstone. The people were packing away the canopy and picking up the chairs. Like it was just over. Before he could take a step forward, his father grabbed his shoulder and turned him right back around. Usually he'd be screaming his head off if the old man tried something like that, but now he just stared at his chest and clenched his teeth down hard. Fingers curling into fists and the other clutching around his remaining flowers. What was he gonna say? Katsuki, you know we love you. He said with a sigh. People make mistakes and it'll be all right. He gently squeezed his shoulder, willing his son to look at him. The words felt good, but at the same time it hurt. Because it wasn't all right. Deku was 6 feet under and he was standing up here and being told, people make mistakes. What the F was that? Why aren't you effing yelling at me, old man? You never yell at me. His voice was loud, but it didn't hold its usual bite. Just a painful, sad tone that coursed through it. He didn't understand. Masaru stared at him sadly. Not knowing how to do this. Katsuki he was interrupted by his wife. Effing brat. He told you we love you, so take it and shut up. If we wanted to say anything else we would. She barked back at her son, glaring at him and clenching her fists. She knew this is what Katsuki needed for him to shut up and understand. He choked back a sound. Finally meeting his mother's eyes, he could feel a warmth in his chest that helped the sting. Whatever, he growled out, shaking his head when his father smiled a little bit. Mitsuki was frowning as she noticed Inko sitting beside the grave, fixing the flowers they had brought in place and seemingly decorating the small gravestone. Inko's husband standing beside her, clearly not sure what to do as he stared hard at the stone. Mitsuki looked back up at her husband. I think we should go soon, she said quietly. Masaru nodded at her. The words hit him and he in a deep breath. He couldn't leave now. Mitsuki was moving first, getting close to Inko and kneeling down to talk with her quietly. Katsuki didn't hear it, but all he knew is that he couldn't leave, not right now. He was moving right behind her, trying not to look at the mound of dirt or the stone as he looked at his mom when she stood. I'm not leaving yet. He wiped his hand over his eyes. Before Mitsuki could say anything, Inko let out a soft sigh. Mitsuki, I'll bring him home. Okay, she said softly, looking up at her friend. Knowing this is what was right. Mitsuki gave her a small smile before she turned back to Katsuki. See you at home, all right? She said sort of gently as she plopped a kiss on his forehead, taking her husband's hand and looking at Katsuki one more time before they headed to the car. Katsuki said a deep breath in, wiping at his forehead as he sunk down a little ways away from Inko, staring at the dirt as he tried to calm down. He'd stopped crying, but he knew he was going to start again. Thanks, he mumbled to her, hugging his knees to his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he thanked someone. Inko smiled just a little, replying with just a small hum as she looked back up at her husband, who was clearly having a rough time of it, looking like he had no idea what to do. She mouthed a few words to him, reaching up to take his hand in hers and gently squeezing it. He nodded at her as he tried to smile, shoving his hands in his pockets as he walked away to sit at a bench for a while. Katsuki didn't even notice he and Inko were alone now. He was just breathing, trying not to think. All he knew is he couldn't go, he couldn't leave yet. He pulled his hand up just to stare at the flowers. Inko sighed softly, returning to her work of fixing up the front of the gravestone. The flower basket on one side while a vase of yellow flowers sat on the other. She opened up the top of her purse. She slowly pulled out a small All Might plush, gently running her fingers over it before setting it so it rested up against the stone. Izuku had had the plush for such a long time, and he had still had it on his desk, and she just thought, maybe he would like it here. Rubbing at her eyes again, she pulled out a small picture frame and set that on the other side. She wanted to sob again at seeing her baby smile, but she couldn't let herself yet. Katsuki slowly got the courage to look back at Inko, clutching around his legs as he moved his eyes to finally look at the gravestone. It was as bad as he thought. It was small, with a little bit of stone on the bottom that went out so things could be placed there. He eyed the flower basket he picked out earlier and then dash. His heart physically hurt again as he looked at the little plush. It just reminded him of everything. He couldn't eye the picture frame, but he could look at the engravements in the stone. In loving memory of Izuku Midoriya, 2005 to 2021. Katsuki felt the tears running down his face as he stared at the simple engravings. Picking up his flowers from his side, he placed them right under the stone, sking in a deep breath as he furiously moved his hands up to wipe at his eyes and red blotchy face, moving his hand to his mouth to bite down harshly on the skin. He wanted to stop feeling. Inko moved her eyes to the boy beside her. She breathed in deeply before pulling a folded piece of paper out from a pocket in her purse. Holding it in her hands for a moment, fingers shaking before she held it out. Looking over at Katsuki with a soft, solemn look. "Katsuki, this is yours." Her soft voice was shaking just as much as her hand. Katsuki looked at her, eyes a little wide as he slowly took the piece of paper from her. No, he didn't know what it was. She didn't seem to offer any hints either, so he just looked at her and softly nodded, pulling it apart carefully until it was unfolded. The first word on the page made his heart stop. Kaken. His eyes grew even wider as he looked over to her, chest aching as he clutched the hand that wasn't holding the paper against his leg. She just gave him a soft look, moving her head back to look at the flowers. Katsuki turned his attention back to the page, reading over the first word again and again. He could pick out the nerd's handwriting in a heartbeat. It was messy, quick, but it was still his. Still Deku's. His free hand moved up to cover his mouth, throat still aching with the need to cry and holding this in his hand just deep in the pain. Eyes blinking, he didn't know if he could keep reading. He had to. It was Deku. For him. Kaken. I always wanted to be a hero. I wanted to help people and smile to let them know everything would be alright. When I walked in they would feel safe again. Without a quirk, I can't. You're right, I can't be a hero, I won't be able to save people. That's all I ever wanted to do. I was just bothering everyone, you and Mom. I don't understand why you hate me so much, Kaken. I wanted to be like you. I wanted to be like All Might. I don't understand what I did, why you didn't want to be around me. Why everyone wanted me gone. If you ever get this, I want to tell you that you'll be a great hero. You'll be able to save so many people. You'll be number one. Maybe I can be one too after this, with a quirk, like you said. I know you'll be a great hero, Kaken. Katsuki was still, left hand coming up to clutch over the sides of his mouth as tears freely fell from his cheeks. He didn't understand how his chest could feel any effing worse. It was like knives were pushed deep and being twisted with an uncaring hand. The sounds that were coming out of his covered mouth were absolutely pathetic. Everything he had just read made him want to die for the first time in his life. Deku took his words to heart. Words said only to make him look better. He always knew Deku looked up to him, and thought he was the effing greatest. Which was such bullshit it made his ears ring. He never hated him, oh God, he loved him. The words FENG hit like a train, he couldn't even grasp it. How could Deku think like this? Like he had somehow done something wrong? Katsuki wanted to FING scream. It was his fault, never Deku's, because Deku was a FENG blessing on this god-forsaken planet. The knives just twisted again in his chest. How could he be so villainous, so disgusting? Deku was a hero if there ever was one, and he FENG killed him. No, I hate you, or this was your fault. Just sentences that felt even worse than if Deku had written down those things. It was all written as if it was somehow Deku's fault, how he didn't want to be here because he was bothering them. It made him endlessly nauseous. The last few sentences only added more fuel to the fire. It made him choke and want to faint die again as he thought about it. How could he do this? Push Deku to the point where he actually did think he was worthless? The words just echoed in his mind and he wanted to clutch his hands over his head and just squeeze, Now he had to be a hero, for Deku, not just for himself anymore, not for the fame, the power or the money. For Deku. He had to make it up to him. To show him just how effing sorry he was. After all, Deku still believed in him. Even after everything, Deku wanted him to be a hero. His hand slowly moved from his mouth, folding the paper carefully, and sticking it into his front pocket. There was no way in hell he was gonna lose it. He was still crying, cheeks all blotched with red as he looked back over to Inko. She looked at him with those eyes, and once again he didn't understand how the Midoriyas could be so caring. She pulled him into one of those soft hugs that he felt like he could just fall into, and he did, holding her close as his arms shook. Katsuki, I forgive you, and I know somewhere, Zuko does too. The words were said in a tone so delicate and real it made his eyes widen. He couldn't FNG accept that, he couldn't. How could she be so forgiving? How could she be so effing nice? He told Deku to jump off the FING roof. Maybe if he hadn't said that, hadn't put the disgusting idea in Deku's head, he would still be here. Katsuki shook his head against Inko's shoulder. Don't say that. I don't FNG deserve that. He growled out, more like a pathetic whine with some sort of anger push though. Again, a million feelings were going on in his head as his heart clenched. He almost felt like Deku had already forgiven him. But it wasn't FING, right? He didn't deserve that. He never would, but he'd be a hero, he'd save people and he'd do it all for Deku. Because Deku deserved it and that's all he could do now. And he would go beyond. Be the best FING hero there was and save the most people because Deku wasn't here to do it himself. He'd go plus ultra. Bakugou. Kirishima could only see his back but he could tell from the spiky hair and rough posture. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he bounded up right beside him, swinging an arm around his shoulders like they'd been friends for years. Man didn't know you dash, he started with a cheerful tone before he noticed the even rougher glare than normal, and his fingers clenching over something he didn't think he'd ever see in Bakugou's hands. It was a few orange flowers wrapped in thin cloth ribbon to hold them together. He didn't even realize it, just so excited to see him out of school that they were standing right beside a small flower cart. It was just bewildering a little and he almost wanted to chuckle. His smile only wavered a tiny bit as he moved his arm off of him. The glare seemed to be softening but Kirishima didn't even care in the first place. He was already excited again. Oh, that's so manly, buying flowers for someone. He gushed out, watching Bakugou's face morph into something he couldn't even describe. It seemed almost like an anger-confused stupor. He'd never thought of Bakugou as the romantic type. It was like the exact opposite of what Bakugou was, from what he'd seen at least. Kirishima's smile got even bigger as he raised his hand again to grasp onto the still stupid Bakugou's shoulder. You gotta tell me, dude. Whose is it? His face scrunched up a little in thought to think about anyone that Bakugou showed anything other than the normal dull anger. Bakugou's face seemed to get even more irritated. Shrugging Kirishima off his shoulder and bringing his hand up and behind his head, thumbs stuck out in a way of pointing. He didn't even say a word yet, as if he was waiting for Kirishima to get it. Maybe he should have looked at his surroundings a bit more. His eyes looked up to the area he was pointing at and he full bodily cringed. Just a little ways up the sidewalk there was clearly a cemetery and he couldn't believe he didn't connect the dots as soon as he walked up. Ah, dude. He frowned. Slumping a bit. He couldn't believe he didn't get the idea from the get-go. Now he probably made Bakugou uncomfortable. Katsuki let out a small sigh as he looked at the sad puppy dog in front of him, turning his eyes away for a moment. It's fine shitty hair. Just don't fucking assume shit like that. He almost grumbled as he moved his eyes back up to the sharp-toothed boy. Kirishima was still deflated but it felt a bit better when Bakugou didn't get all angry. The look on his face was still something that made his heart clench. It was the same look he had sometimes, sitting in class and doing work. Kirishima never understood the look until now and he almost felt like he should have asked before. He knew Bakugou wouldn't say anything if he had tried. During hero training, what Bakugou liked the most, Kirishima couldn't help but notice the solemn look in his friend's eyes when the firecracker looked up at All Might. It didn't happen very much but Kirishima noticed it. It made his heart clench to see someone so manly and strong upset. And now, maybe he could figure out what was wrong. After all, he really did want to be close to Bakugou. Yeah dude, I'm really sorry dash. His hand came up to rub at the back of his head in a bit of embarrassment. Eyes moving a bit to the side as he chuckled awkwardly. Katsuki made a gruff sound as he moved up the sidewalk a little, glancing back over to the black fencing that enclosed the cemetery. He's waiting. He's gotta be there. Katsuki turned his head back to his FR classmate and frowned a little deeper. Kirishima looked like a freaking puppy who didn't get a bone. Come on, he grumbled out. He couldn't just shoo him away. He didn't want to see the happy fucker all sad. His brain hit him with thoughts to not let him come with, but he wasn't embarrassed. No, he wasn't FNG embarrassed. Without looking back, he stepped forward, moving on with his hands still clenched over the flowers. Kirishima was almost dumbstruck again. Hesitating for only a second, he bounced right up to Bakugou's side. Already grinning again, he could be there for Bakugou. Kirishima could see the stern look on his face, but it didn't faze him. Bakugou was such a great guy. He was surprised he hadn't shoved him away and stomped off. He just followed beside him, just happy to be there, his new mission to just be there for the blonde. Then they'd be closer than ever. They walked past the gate and into the large green pasture that was carved with sidewalks and littered with gravestones of all sizes. The heavy feeling of just walking through hit him a little, but he just kept walking right beside Bakugou. Katsuki only felt slight irritation at the bouncing boy walking beside him. He was here for one person and one person only. It didn't matter if there was other company. Then he could see it. The small patch of bright grass and the tiny headstone. He felt himself walking faster, and before he knew it, he was grinning. The smile tore through his usual angry demeanor. He didn't even realize Kirishima was there anymore. It was just them. Just him. He sat himself up on his knees in the grass, eyes ignoring the picture frame just for a moment. He couldn't even look at him yet. He was smiling, but his voice came out wavering. Hey, got you some new ones. He wrapped his fingers around the little vase that sat on the side, pulling the flowers that were barely withered out and pressing the new bright orange ones into it. Grabbing the mini water bottle he had in his hoodie pocket and pouring it in the vase carefully. He slowly placed the vase back down, absent-mindedly moving the flowers around to make them look nicer. His eyes moved back to the main gravestone and he let out a soft sigh. Kirishima watched this in almost shock. The little sad smile that appeared on Bakugou's face made something stir in his chest. It was like he wasn't even there anymore. He watched him, eyes a little wide, and his usual smile turned into a line of increasing worry. It was like seeing another world. His eyes moved to the headstone and felt a little sick at the numbers. That was just months ago, their age. The little plush on the left made him think as he carefully sat near Bakugou, letting him have the distance. Katsuki wasn't smiling at the moment. Eyes moving over the picture frame, and his heart clenched painfully. He wanted to say sorry again. He wanted to see him again. He wanted to hear his FING annoying voice, and he wanted to run his fingers into those green curls that still, even now, made his heart flutter. His throat clenched just as hard as his chest, and he let his fingers move over the edge of the frame. How could he still feel this way? After months he still felt like dash. He could feel the tears coming again, but he shook his head and a wobbly grin replaced the frown. Guess what FNG happened at the sports festival, nerd? He paused for just a second, like Deku was actually sitting there listening, big eyes and his mouth actually closed to hear what Katsuki was gonna say. Ha, I thing one. You should have seen it, would have made you faint with all your hero worship. Of course I made it through the first games easily. What was really important was the one-on-one battles. He grinned wider as he thought of it, eyes almost bright with the thought of Deku singing his praises again. The sound of Bakugou talking so nonchalantly, so real, made Kirishima feel almost uncomfortable. He felt like he was seeing something so personal, but if Bakugou wanted him here, then he would be here. He ran his fingers over his shorts as he watched Bakugou continue, cringing a little, sharp teeth going over his lip as he listened. I won the first match against some pink-cheeked girl. She had some kind of gravity quirk, but she couldn't FING touch me. Even her attempt at throwing a bunch of debris didn't work because I blew it the F up. He could just hear him, wow. I didn't know your explosions could get that big kakin. How much sweat did you have to produce to get that kind of volume? Dash, God, he'd keep going, wouldn't he? Maybe he'd ask if it hurt his hands, and maybe Katsuki would say it did, if only just a little bit. Then I went against this fucker over here. He stuck his thumb out, pointing to the fucker beside him. He clenched his teeth hard, remembering Kirishima was right there. He shook it off and continued. He grinned a little again, snickering. He's strong. Couldn't put a dent in him for a bit, but he was working his whole body too hard, and I kept pushing it till he was down. He'd already mentioned a few of their quirks to Deku before, so he didn't feel the need to tell him again. Katsuki didn't notice Kirishima almost jump at the mention of himself, and Kirishima didn't say a word. He just looked on, feeling a bit sicker by the moment. Bakugou was the last person he'd ever think of that would talk like this to a gravestone. He'd imagined they'd sit here for a bit, Bakugou would replace the flowers, and Kirishima could put a hand on his shoulder and squeeze, and maybe Bakugou wouldn't push him away this time. He couldn't even try that now. He'd never heard Bakugou talk this much. The DMN bird battle took a bit too. He shouldn't have let everyone know his DMN weakness, but that's not the FING thing, the last one with FING half and half. Thinks he's so good that he doesn't even use half of his quirk. He tried to make a fool of me. Katsuki growled the last part out. He hated that fucker. Thinks he's so good because he's got the second top hero as his daddy. I blew him the F up, but he didn't try. He clenched his hands angrily, just imagining Deku there. Maybe he would have cheered him on, maybe not. He couldn't even think about how unsatisfying that win was, how he almost wanted to cry. He couldn't be shown up, he had to be the best. He had to be the best, especially now, when this was for Deku. But it doesn't dash, he gulped. He was trying. Matter. I won for you. He could feel his throat closing up again. He reached around his neck and under his hoodie, pulling the medal off and holding it in his hands. He looked away from the frame, staring at the All Might plush for a second. All Might handed me this award. I know how much you fucking worship the dude. He stopped, shaking his head a little and letting out a shaky breath. This is yours. You deserve it more than I ever will. The words were hard to say, and they were said in almost a whisper. But it was true. God, Deku deserved it. He deserved better. He wrapped the ribbon over the frame, the medal hanging at the bottom and touching the grass. Kirishima was more than dumbstruck. When had he ever heard Bakugou say one bad thing about himself? Ever? No way. Had he heard him talk about his feelings? It was almost laughable, but Kirishima felt very, very far away from laughing. He didn't understand one thing. He stared at the medal and then back at Bakugou. Who was this person? Definitely not a family member, that was clear with the name on the stone. He couldn't help but try to think as he gave Bakugou the silence he needed. It struck him with such respect. How manly could Bakugou get? Katsuki stared at it for a moment. Stared at the photo. Maybe it was stupid to leave such a valuable thing there, but it was his. It had to be his. He moved his head forward, leaning it on the top edge of the gravestone, and then he was just whispering. He didn't care anymore about how people would look at him, how Kirishima might look at him. He was talking to Deku, only him. I'm so sorry. I love you, I really do. He was holding back tears. But why did he still feel this way? Why hadn't the feelings left him yet? Why had they started? Why Deku? He knew why. Deku was perfect. Is perfect. His heart clenched again, and he just wanted to wrap his arms around him. He needed it. He wanted to see him again. Why the F? Was he such a horrible person? He tried to shut those thoughts away. He was better. He was trying to make it up. He never would, but he had to try. If Deku could see him, could hear him, he would understand. He would finally get the truth. He was mouthing it now, like it would just magically make Deku pop up. He hasn't gotten this worked up in weeks. Kirishima's mouth opened slightly as he watched Bakugou break a little, the tough facade failing. He didn't understand a thing. Watching Bakugou like this made him sick, a nasty swirling feeling. He wanted to say something. He wanted to help, to be there for him. Comfort him somehow, but he knew he couldn't. Not now, at least. He'd never imagined Bakugou so emotional. He couldn't help but wonder what happened, what the relationship was. Why Bakugou had to apologize. He'd only heard an apology on rare occasions, and it was definitely not said in the kind of tone he used here. His heart clenched for him, and he wanted to hug Bakugou again, but he held back. He'd try to help, just be a rock to steady him. Bakugou moved his head away, wiping at a few tears that fell, and abruptly stood up. "Gotta go," he mumbled with a rough sound to Deku. He kept seeing his face, seeing him cry. He kept seeing him smile and seeing him laugh. It was torture. He noticed the redhead get up, he never noticed him sit down. He couldn't look at him yet. He was a bit ashamed about that fact, but he just couldn't. He was walking now, back on the sidewalk with the boy on his right. He got out of his head a little as he heard him speak up for the first time. "You're leaving it there?" His voice was so soft it made Katsuki angry. But he ignored it for Deku. Yes, his voice was soft too, the rough edge still there, but it was like he didn't have the energy to get angry. The walk was quiet then, the silence stretching, and when they were almost at the gate, Kirishima spoke up again. His voice almost hesitant. "Who was he?" Katsuki grinned, "If only a little. He was fucking everything."